Hey guys, my guest today, author Tom Shroder, is going to be talking about children and past lives. See you in about 5 minutes. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, where do we go? Hey everybody, one of those days. Hey everybody, how's it going? I hope you're having a good day so far. I know I am. I'm having a blast, absolute blast. Anyway, we're up here early this morning to do this, and I'm really excited because my guest is talking about something that really interests me, and that's past lives and involving children. My name is Shroder. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm also the owner and bouncing around of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state, which means no matter where you're at, we can get to you. It might take us a while. California is a huge state. Like I always like to say is when people think of California, they kind of think of us like Hawaii, right? With beaches and bikinis and surfing. Well, we are like that on our West Coast. Get up north, it gets kind of colder. You got, instead of bare-chested surfers, you got guys in wetsuits. But that's cool, right? That's cool. But like I said, California is huge. We not only have the ocean area on the West Coast, we have mountains, we have big valleys, we have desert, we have all kinds of desert, all kinds of wide open farmland. So that's why when I say it might take us a couple days to get to you, that's why. However, we do have mediums on staff who can call you ahead of time and kind of try to settle things down, assuming you have something paranormal going on, try and settle things down, before we get out there. And in most cases, they can do that. But, it won't take us more than 2 or 3 days to get out to you. And we do it, like I said, we have people down those areas. Anyway, my guest today, Tom Shroder, is a journalist, just like me. And he's written several books. And one book that caught my interest was Past Lives and Children. And what caught my interest with it was he looks upon it from a scientific point of view. So it should be an interesting interview. All right, if you're watching from Facebook and you haven't done so already, hit that follow button, especially if you like what you hear today. We do this 6 days a week. Sunday is our paranormal reading day, but the rest of the week we have great guests on, like today's guest. And you can check all those shows out. And that would be over at YouTube, our YouTube site, youtube.com/@CaliforniaHauntsRadio. That's another place. If you like what you hear, do me a favor and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Because, we're just trying to get those subscription numbers up. We're 300 away from that 1,000 subscribers. So we're building up. Also, for YouTube and Facebook and even people coming over from TikTok, because we're broadcasting on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitch, Twitter. If you leave comments or if you give me a happy face and show me some love, oh, there we went, disappeared. It's a Mario kind of day. And, and you leave comments and things like that. What it does is it puts us up higher in the FYP, which gets us out to more people. So if you could help me out with that, I'd appreciate it. Okay, that being said, I'm going to bring my guest in, and it's going to be a very interesting interview. Here we go. Good morning.
Good morning. Actually, it's noon. It's past noon here, but.
Oh, that's right. You're 2 hours ahead, huh?
3.
Oh, 3? Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area.
Oh, that's cool. That's very cool. Tell me about you, sir.
Well, I've been a journalist since my college newspaper days, and I worked for a bunch of newspapers. I worked for, most recently, the Washington Post, where I was editor of the Sunday magazine until 2009. And since then, I've been writing and editing books. Old Souls was one of the first books I wrote. That's the book you're talking about. It's called Old Souls, Compelling Evidence from Children Who Remember Past Lives. And I also wrote a book called Acid Test, which is about the attempt to prove that psychedelics can be an effective drug for therapy. And I've written a number of other books, and I've ghostwritten some books, including a book called The Operator, which is the story of Robert O'Neill, the man who killed bin Laden. So I've done a lot of different things, and I've been doing it for quite some time.
I was looking through your books. Everyone's a different genre, pretty much, and I think it's fascinating. Now, coming into the book that we're going to be talking about today, like I said in the intro, what I found so interesting was that you didn't look upon it from a psychic's point of view or anything like this. You actually hung out with the scientists or research the scientists that were doing the research on this stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously you can believe in reincarnation for any number of reasons. You can believe it because you've had a personal experience, or just because you have a feeling, or because you really would long to see a loved one again. But for me, I've always been a believer in empirical evidence. And I don't want to believe in anything just because I want to believe in it or because someone tells me to believe in it. If I believe something's true, I want there to be evidence for it, concrete, physical evidence. And that's what impressed me about the man that I followed on his research, a guy named Ian Stevenson, and who died in the early 2000s. But when I first encountered him, I was doing a story for a magazine about people who sort of were regressed to remember past lives in hypnotic sessions. And I didn't find that very convincing, because when they talked about, first of all, in hypnosis, the whole idea is to sort of let your mind go and sort of go where it will, and to indulge in your imagination. And so people came up with things that none of the information that they sort of related in those things was anything that they couldn't have gotten from like a historical novel or even a romance novel or just a history class. They're remembering lives hundreds of years earlier, and the things that they remembered were things that anybody could have known.
Sure.
And so I wasn't that impressed with that as evidence. But when I was doing my research, I came across Ian Stevenson, who is a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, and he had been the head of the department of psychiatry there. And he had always been interested in parapsychology, and he came across these case reports that they were all of different quality, and they were related in different ways, but one thing they had in common was they were centered around a small child who began to speak spontaneously about what sounded like previous existence. And so he got interested in that, and he started to travel the world, and this was in the 60s, looking for case reports of these, and then trying to track them down and to verify them, almost like really almost like a investigative journalist would, by interviewing witnesses, by investigating circumstances, and what he found was that in many of these cases, that the children had said things so specific that they were able to identify a specific person who the child appeared to be claiming to have been, a dead individual who, and unlike the hypnosis cases, these cases were people who had died just previous to their birth. Some cases almost immediately, in some cases several years or even a decade. But we're not talking about multi-generations past. And in fact, some of the cases that he started to research were in cultures that believed in reincarnation. So a lot of people said, well, they're just making these up to support their beliefs. And what I thought was, well, wait a second. If a belief in reincarnation was enough to cause people to manufacture false cases of it, then wouldn't it be true that a disbelief in reincarnation was enough to suppress actual cases? And people would say, well, why aren't there cases in the United States or in Europe? Well, in fact, there were many cases, not as many as known as in India And for instance, in Lebanon, where the
Mm-hmm.
Druze religion believes in reincarnation. But, you know, my own son used to say something like, when I was a daddy, and I would correct him like he was making a grammatical error. I said, no, you
Right.
mean when you're going to be a dad. So if he really had a memory of being a father at some point in time, I would have shut him down. And that's the way it would work, is that you would suppress these things. So I didn't think that it was really an argument against this, that most of these cases that he was studying were in cultures that believed in reincarnation, because, you know, I think obviously if they were open to the idea, then the
Mm-hmm.
children would not be suppressed or not encouraged. And of course, some of these kids were suppressed anyway, because not all of these cases came from families that believed in reincarnation. And in fact, there were some where they were embarrassed or angry about that their kid was saying this stuff.
What in looking at the research and working, what impressed you the most about this whole reincarnation thing? Because as a journalist, I mean, we're trained to stay down the middle with topics. Did this turn you into a believer, or are you still kind of on the fringe on it?
Well, that's a complicated question, and Stevenson would ask me that too. And in fact, this book came out. It will have been 25 years in June. So in 25 years, so in June they're coming out. Simon and Schuster is going to put out a 25th anniversary edition of this book, and
Mm-hmm.
I've written a 6,000 word chapter explaining just that, just where I stand on my personal belief. And so it's complicated. And if you want to find out,
Read the book.
in June, you can read the book.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when you first started, studying into this, what stood out to you the most about these cases?
Well, I think the first thing that caught my attention was that Stevenson, brought such an even handed and agnostic sort of approach to studying
Mm-hmm.
these cases. He didn't go in there believing that they were real, but he didn't also go in there scorning it, and thinking there's
Mm-hmm.
no way this can be real, which is what a lot of his colleagues would say. They'd
Mm-hmm.
say, well, the idea of reincarnation is absurd to begin with, so why pay any attention to this? He went in with an open mind. And the thing that really stood out to me was that here were cases of children who were saying things as soon as they could talk. So unlike the people, the adults who were in these hypnotic sessions, they had no source of knowledge. So if
Mm-hmm.
they came up, they weren't reading novels and magazines or watching movies, and they didn't have a wide range of acquaintances or a college education to learn
Mm-hmm.
stuff about the past. So when they started saying specific things that it seemed like there's no about that turned out to be true
Mm-hmm.
about people they'd never met, then suddenly you're finding it very hard to explain that by normal means. So that's what impressed me. And the kind of things these kids would say is, often it started out where they'd say, like, they'd go by this, they'd go on a trip with their family to a town they'd never been to before, and they'd suddenly say, I used to live in this town. And they'd say, and I had, and my mother was very religious and my father had a long beard. Well, they're with their mother and father and they're not very religious and they don't have a long beard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the parents are going, what? And so then the kid over time starts giving more and more details, and they'll say, I had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and they'd give the names of the sisters and brothers, and they'd say, and we lived in a big house, and we had 3 water buffalo, um, and my father drove a car, a black car, and sometimes they'd even give the name of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens in many cases is that either the family of the child will send to that town to say, was there anybody by this name in that town? Or it would, through intermediaries, the
Mm-hmm.
family of that name in the town would hear about this, and they'd hear, hey, there's some kid claiming to be your dead uncle, and so then they would come and check it out. And, either, and in many cases they came and, like, the kid would say, Aunt Betsy, you're here, you finally come to find me, things like that. And people would be witnessing this. And in many cases, the claims that the child made beforehand would be written down, or they at least be told to many people. So Stevenson could interview these people and confirm that these claims arose before the two families met. And there was one case in particular. Well, there were many cases that were astounding. But for instance, in one case, there was this little boy who claimed to remember this guy who had died. And he said that he really liked to hunt, and he liked to hunt with his friends. And that, so they went to the house where the dead person had lived in another town. Kid had never been there. And the kid walks into the house and he points to the wall and says, "That's where I used to keep my rifles." Well, they look at the wall and it's blank. It's just this blank wall. And this is an abandoned house at this point. Nobody's living there. So the guy that they're with takes a hammer and smashes the wall, and the wall breaks open. And there, sure enough, is a little gun rack that somebody had plastered over.
Wow.
So there those kind of things. I mean, there are a whole bunch of stories like that. And they're really, they're really quite remarkable and hard to explain if, in some normal way.
When you started to look, like you say, there's so many stories like this. How were you able to choose particular ones for your book? I mean, it must have been hard.
Well, because what I wanted to do, Stevenson didn't want a bunch of what he called sensationalistic coverage on it. There were all these other people who were popularizing things like the hypnosis stories, etc., and they were selling a lot of books. Stevenson didn't want that. What he wanted more than anything was for his scientific colleagues to take him seriously. So he thought that, having a journalist along would only make that harder, because he didn't trust that they would, do a serious job of it. So it took me like 2 years to convince him to let me come along with him on his research trips. And at the time he was 80, and he said, and his wife had said, "You're not making any more research trips." But he's told me, "Well, I'll probably do another one or two." And so I persuaded him eventually to let me come along with him. So he was visiting past cases that he talked to years earlier to follow up on them. And while we were there, some new cases sort of presented themselves. And so basically I was just following his lead and watching what he did, and seeing what cases that he wanted to go see.
Somewhere along the line, I've heard that, with these kids that have this, that when they reach a certain age, as they get closer to teen or adulthood, this whole thing kind of settles down. Is that what you guys found in your follow-ups?
Well, in general, what happens is that the kids start talking about it about the time where they can learn how to make, talk in complete sentences. And some of them can be very emotional about it. They can, like there was this one little girl who started saying, "You're not my real mom and dad," and her parents would punish her for it, and tell her to shut up, basically. And so one day, the milkman was coming around, and that doesn't mean, this is India, so that doesn't mean the guy that delivers a crate of milk to the front door. It means the guy that comes to milk the water buffalo for them. So anyway, the milkman's walking by, and the little girl runs out and said, "Can you help me? I want to find my real family. These people won't let me, won't help me." And she started telling him her name, what her name was, her previous name, and where they lived, etc. And she's like 5 or 6 at this point. And so the milkman thinks this is pretty strange. He's Indian, so he's heard about reincarnation stories before, but still, it hasn't really encountered them up close and personal like this. And he happens to know somebody in the town that this kid is saying she really came from, and she named the family. So he talks to this friend, and the friend says, "Yeah, there is a family like that, and they lost their daughter, about 3 years ago, and she was like a young teenager at the time, and she got hit by a car, and so that person told the family about it, and the family comes to see this girl and her family without announcing themselves. Some of these sort of elders of the village and the father of the family, they come there and they don't identify themselves because they want to see what happens. And the little girl was out, so the father invites them in, and they sit in the courtyard and gives them tea and everything. And then the little girl comes back from playing, and as she walks in, she freezes, and then she runs to the man who is her father and jumps on his lap and say, "You've come for me, please take me home." And so there are all these people who witnessed this. And, like we went and first talked to her family, her current family. And then we went to this other village and had all these people who had witnessed this say, "Oh, yeah." And then she came to the village and she was able to identify her brothers and sisters. And she even asked, there was one sister who had grown up and gone off with her husband's family. And she had asked, "Where is that sister? Where is she? I don't see her." So and all these people are confirming that this is true. So so it is very impressive. And now I'm forgetting what launched me on this, but what was your question again?
Oh, the question was, I had heard from previous
that they forget,
people that they forget after a certain age.
Right. And what happens is that when they're like 7 or 8, about the time that they really start developing their own social lives in their current incarnation, they stop talking about it, and they kind of they get vague about the memories. And this one woman who is like 22 says, "I remember the feeling of remembering, but I don't remember the specific memories anymore." But what happens to the children where a family is identified and they meet, sometimes they develop lifelong relationships with those families. So they'll have 2 families. They'll have their current life family, and then they'll have their previous life family. And they have a relationship with them that can last a lifetime in certain instances. There was the one girl I told you about who was in her 20s. When she was a little girl, she started talking about them as soon as she could talk. And the family, and she gave family, she named like a half dozen of her siblings, and her mother and her father and her husband. She remembered the life of a woman who it turned out had actually died of during surgery in the United States, who had been flown to the United States for surgery and died. And once these families connected, the daughters of the dead woman came to see her unannounced, as often happens. And the first thing she said to him was, "You're here, you've come to visit me." And the first thing she asked was, "Did your uncle give you my jewelry as I asked him to?" And that blew them away, because only the family knew that before the fatal surgery, this woman had told her brother that how she wanted her jewelry distributed if she didn't make it. And only the family knew that. So this convinced the daughters, who were now grown, that maybe there was something to this. And so then once she made the connection, she started calling their father, her husband in her mind from her previous life, like daily. This little girl would be calling him up. And he came to believe that she really was the reincarnation of his dead wife. And so he'd have these conversations with her. And then finally, as she was getting older, he said, "I really don't want to talk to you anymore. Not because I don't want to, but because you need to have your own life now. And you can't keep hanging on the past life. So he said he cut it off, and that was when Stevenson had interviewed them, maybe like 15 years earlier. So then when we go to see the family, and this family was a very prominent and wealthy family, and they did business in Saudi Arabia where reincarnation is not cool. People don't want it. So they didn't want anything to do with this. And they also thought maybe this family was angling to get some of their money or something because they were wealthy. And so when we knocked on their door, the daughters came out and said, "We can't talk to you about this. This caused the last time you interviewed us, this caused a big problem in our family, and we don't want it to happen anymore." But their father was there, and he kind of lets us in, and he kind of says, when they go out of the room, he tells us, I told her I didn't want to talk to her anymore, but the truth is, I have continued to talk to her, and in fact, I still talk to her like once a week on the phone. And then the daughters come back out, and I say, "Well, I mean, did you believe that she was really?" And they said, "This is has caused us a lot of trouble, but we can't deny that this girl knew things that only our mother could have known."
Wow.
And I said, and then some people say, well, people want this to be true, so they kind of allow themselves to believe things and sort of maybe unconsciously manufacture evidence, like maybe she didn't say, "Did your uncle give you the jewelry I did?" Maybe they started talking about it, and then she seemed to pick it up, and they remembered it as if the little girl had brought it up. Maybe that's possible, and because they want it so bad. And so I said, well, was it reassuring to see this little girl and know that your mother had not just disappeared forever, but she had returned? And they said, no, it was really haunting and disturbing. This wasn't our mother. This was a little girl who was speaking with our mother's voice. And we found that very upsetting, actually. So, so all these explanations for how people would fool themselves, there were always cases that would show that wasn't necessarily the case.
You mentioned earlier about, where the bulk of the cases are of this, and you mentioned that you don't find as many in the United States. Why do you think that is?
Well, as I mentioned, it could be because people instantly, if their kids begin to say stuff like this, they instantly shut them down. And the other thing is, it turns out that a lot of kids, I mean, when I was doing the book and ever since, I have lots of people say, my cousin used to say that, he was really from the South, or my brother said once we were on a family trip and he starts jumping up and down saying, "See that house, I lived in that house." So it turns out there are a lot, but not as many of them have the details that could actually lead to tracking them down. And that could also be because our society, families don't stick around as much. They're not 3 generations of family living under one roof. So social mobility is so great that maybe that has something to do with it. But on the other hand, there are some famous cases now that have come to light in the years since Old Soul was published of American kids who do have very impressive stories. And there's one famous case of a kid who appeared to remember the life of a pilot who was shot down in the battle in the Pacific. He was a pilot, and he started. It started because he was obsessed with these with World War II, and he's looking at this picture book when he's very little of a plane, and it had a little cylindrical thing hanging down below its nose cone. And the mother said something like, "Well, that's the bomb." And the kid said, No, that's not a bomb. That's a drop tank. And it turns out that this is a model of World War II plane, and
Uh-huh.
that thing there was called a drop tank, and it's for spare gas, and it wasn't a bomb. So that got them curious, and the kids started saying, that his name was James, but he says, I'm the third James. And he said, and my best friend, and I was on a ship called, and he gave the name, and he gave a name of a ship, and
Hmm.
he gave the name of what he said was his best friend. And it turns out that there was a ship by that name in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and there was a guy by the name that he said his best friend was um, on that ship. And it turned also out that the only pilot to die in that battle was a guy named James Leninger, and
Wow.
he was James Leninger Jr. So when this boy kept signing his pictures James 3, he said, yeah, I'm the third James. Well, there was a James Leninger Sr., James Leninger Jr., and then this kid was named James too, so the third James. So anyway, there were a lot of details like that. That and the parents, there've been documentaries about it. They wrote a book, so it's been on television.
Uh-huh.
And whenever parents start to publicize things, you can say, well, they have a motive to make this stuff up, or to
Uh-huh.
to exaggerate it, because they're selling books.
Uh-huh.
But Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia, a researcher, came down and researched this case, and he looked at documents that proved, for instance, when some of these claims the kid made about the name of the ship and the name of his shipmate on
Uh-huh.
the ship, uh, they he found internet searches that were timed and dated that proved that they were asking these questions before they ever met any of the survivors or any of the people from there.
Huh.
So, which sort of lends credence to the fact that they were investigating this, based on stuff that they didn't know in advance.
Right, right. And when you talk about doing research, what does that research entail? I mean, where do you look, to find background like this on people?
Oh well, I mean, there are all sorts of different. I mean, in the book, I sort of I kind of wrote it like a narrative where it's following the research, because
Uh-huh.
When even 25 years ago, doing research, I mean, Lebanon had just had this really violent civil war,
Right.
and and um, and uh, and in India, it's still 25 years ago, it was a lot less developed than it is now. And so we would go back, way back into the boonies. It would take 8 hours of driving on a bumpy road, sort of dodging camels and ox carts and stuff. It was very colorful stuff to get to these remote villages, where these cases, and the villagers might, in some cases, they'd be a little hostile, because here was this rich American guy coming in this fancy car, and they're saying, "Where's our, what's in it for us?" sort of attitude.
Right.
So a lot of the research is interviewing
Uh-huh.
witnesses and people who knew the children and the families and the children themselves. And then he also did things like, he'd check police records, because sometimes these kids would remember a violent death.
Uh-huh.
So he'd go and check police records. Remember, I told you that one little girl who asked the milkman to help her find the family.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Remember that girl, the girl she claimed to remember, had been hit by a car, and
Right.
so we went to this rural police outpost and started looking through records to see if we could find records of the accident.
Uh-huh.
And it was wild. They were all written on these big ledgers, in handwritten, the records, and these ledgers were in this closet stacked up, and some of them were falling on the floor, and we had to dig through all that stuff to find the
Uh-huh.
records of it. And one of the things the girl said was that she had remembered falling from a height. And I said, well, that doesn't really match up because it says, that this girl died from a car accident, gotten hit by a car. So then when we finally find the record of that accident in this police closet, and it actually says that the witnesses said that the car hit her and she flew 12 feet in the air.
Wow.
Before she hit the ground. So suddenly I said, oh, she remembered falling from a height. So, there's great moments like that. And there was another case where a guy remembered being riding as a passenger in a car, and his friend was a hothead who was driving, and some car drove by and like shouted at him and gave him the finger. And so this guy started racing after him, and he came to a curve and the car rolled. And he said he remembered lying there, and they went to everybody else, but they kind of ignored him. That was his memory. And he was the only one who was killed. Everybody else lived. So, so we went to try to document this accident. And in that case, there was a defunct newspaper, who might have written a story about it. And we learned that the newspaper's microfilm had been bought up by another newspaper. So we went there and we spent like a day in the microfilm room going through all these old things. And then sure enough, we found a description of the accident that matched his memory. So
that's incredible.
That kind of stuff. There are other cases where there are birthmarks on children that seem to correspond to injuries from a previous life. So he would document this by photographing the birthmarks, and then he'd go and find autopsy reports or hospital records of the injuries that occurred to the previous personality, and he'd compare the descriptions of the injuries to these birthmarks. In some cases, they matched up really well.
This is all fascinating to me because, you're in a foreign country and you're having to do this research in this. It's not like it is here where you could go to the county courthouse, and pull that stuff. You really, really have to dig and find the places to gather that information.
Yeah, and he had pursued this for, 30, 40 years until he died, basically. And he started in the early 60s. So, back then it was even wilder. And he was, he didn't care about luxury, and he didn't want to spend his whole research budget on hotels and stuff. So we were staying in some pretty rugged places half the time. It was really interesting. Like one place we stayed at in India, there's like, there's like stains on the bed, and the window's broken, and I wake up in the morning and this crow is sitting on the bathroom window ledge cawing, waking me up. And it was quite an adventure.
You made me laugh at the ox cart because back in the 70s, when I was around 12, 13 years old, or 8 years old rather, further back, we went to Hungary. And while it was still, there were still old timers out there, right? So you'd be driving along on this country road, and all of a sudden you'd have to hit the brakes. There would be an ox cart with hay on the back.
Yeah.
You don't want to hit them, so you gotta either swerve or just hit those brakes really hard. So I know what you're talking about, the ox carts. That's what made me smile and laugh about it.
And then just throw some camels into that picture, and you've got some really weird stuff.
So were the people? When you talk to the people, like the one family, the guy, kind of covered up. I can see how it could cause problems. When this woman says it's the mother, and it can cause internal problems within the family. But were the families that you talked to, and because obviously they were receptive because the neighbors were coming up with stories too, or other people, right, as well.
Well, there's a whole range. Some of the families were very receptive, and some were the families were almost very unhappy to see us coming around. And some of the families, were themselves mystified by it and wanted to know. And some of the families had accepted it readily and just figured that, this was another
Right.
connection. That one family where we went and talked to the kid, he remembered this was in Lebanon. And I remember I said that this was just a few years after a really nasty civil war there. And the kid remembered being a teenager who was killed in he was helping his friends in a militia, and they had a sort of a gun emplacement,
Right.
and he had been killed by shrapnel, is what his memory was, and so the family of the kid who was killed, and this is maybe, the kid was 19, and this was maybe eight years after he died, and the kid was 6 or 7 at the time. But the family had pretty much accepted him as their lost son. And so when someone in the family died, even though he had at the time he was the oldest in the family before he died. And then there's a 7-year-old who came to all the ceremonies around this death in the family and took the role of the eldest son, even though now he had siblings that were well older than he was now. And so, he just fulfilled the role of the dead child in that family.
Interesting. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, so some of these people had lifelong relationships with their family, and then other people, once they sort of just, quote, made the connection to the family that they had remembered, they stopped talking about it almost immediately. They had maybe talked about it a lot, and maybe they'd even had emotional difficulties, saying that they missed the family. But then once they made the connection, they were okay, and they was like, okay, I'm on with my new life here, and they stopped worrying about it.
Well, I can see how that could happen, because I mean, all your life you're dealing with, like, you feel like you're someone else, and you're living in this other life. But then when you're finally able to get that off your chest, and make those connections, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's like, okay,
right, exactly, and
I got this going on.
That's what it looked like. And
I can see that.
The if you just see the facts of these cases written down, they're very compelling, and you think, well, if all this is true, of what they're saying, then it's hard to explain it in a normal way, as I said. But so people say, well, okay, we know that that if you do brain surgery and you damage a certain part of the brain, that memories are gone. That you lose memories of a certain type. And so if that's true, then the complete destruction of the brain should obliterate all memory. So in other words, they're saying there's lots of evidence that all the things we think of as personality come from physical reality, come from brain cells and neurochemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So they're saying, okay, so they're starting from a position saying, so these stories can't really represent reincarnation, because if so, what is it that's reincarnated? What is it that emerges from a previous personality, somehow survives physical death, and somehow is transplanted into a new body? How does that happen? Nobody has any hint, any suggestion, or any evidence for anything that could allow that to happen. So they say, okay, so these cases either have to be lying, it has to be intentional fraud, or it has to be that, or maybe some delusion, or insanity, or maybe that, culturally they're being encouraged to do this for various reasons, either status or just for the emotional, inability to accept the loss of a loved one, and then, maybe that they witnesses are notoriously inaccurate. They misremember things.
Right.
They think they see things that they don't see. Their memories change over time. They create new memories in order to fulfill a narrative. So I kept all of these things in mind whenever we were interviewing these families and these kids, and I didn't see any evidence of any of that. They all just seemed completely normal. They didn't care if we believed in this or not. And they were just answering our questions. And in some cases, you could see their emotions, that they really, that this was real to them. And they just seemed very genuine and very, they certainly didn't seem to care if they made their case or not. They were just answering our questions. So that, in the end, that was the thing that impressed me the most, that these just seemed like intelligent, normal, sane, honest people to me.
That kind of leads to my next question is, in looking at all these cases and having gone out to talk to these people, did you find a common thread?
Well, one thing that, yes, I mean, the common thread was that these were kids who started making these statements or making these claims way before they could read,
Sure.
So that was the thread that really tied them together. But the other thing was that there were a huge variety. I mean, it wasn't like all people who died violent deaths, for instance, that they remembered. And it wasn't all, people of their same cultural or religious group either. Sometimes Hindus would remember the life of a Muslim, or vice versa. Mostly it was same sex, but there were cases where a boy remembered the life of a girl, or vice versa. So almost any variation you can think of. In some cases, the deaths were very close to the birth of the child, and in some cases they were further away. I mean, none of them that I encountered were multiple generations away, although some people did have more than one previous life memory. Some, they had some from earlier lives, but none of them were, hundreds of years ago. And also, they weren't celebrity. That's the other thing about a lot of hypnosis things, is that they're either glamorous people, or they remember glamorous lives.
Cleopatra, yeah.
But these were people who remembered the life of like a middle-aged truck driver.
Right.
So there was no glamour associated with it at all. It was just like the lives they remembered were just as ordinary as the lives they were living.
Sure.
And also they didn't. The other thing that really struck me was that these cases, people who said, well, of course, Hindus will believe these cases because it supports their religion. Well, there were details of the things that they remembered that went against what the religious beliefs. For instance, there was very little to no substantiation of the idea of karma, which is that you were rewarded or punished for behavior in a previous life. I mean, there'd be somebody who remembered the life of a very laudable person, and it's a little kid who's living in squalor somewhere. So where was the karma? And the Druze believed that the transmission of the soul, or whatever you want to call it, happened instantly upon death to a birth that was happening right then. But the Druze children didn't support that. They remembered lives of somebody who died 2-3 years before they were born. So if this was all a sort of cultural stunt to support their beliefs, it wasn't, they weren't doing a very good job of it.
Well, while you're saying that, I remember I just heard something another show somewhere where the gentleman had been saying that when we die, we're given a choice. We're given a, after the life review and all that, we're given a choice to either come back and reincarnate right away or stick around, back there. So that kind of falls in jive with what you're talking about, where maybe that's why some of these kids, when you find out about the death that happened, that it happened the day before they were born or the day they were born.
Yeah, well, that was very very rare.
Mm-hmm.
That in these cases, and so there was even one case where there was a grown woman who had a seizure of some kind, and this is in a village in India, and she kind of fell down in the fields, and everybody sort of gathered around her, and she didn't revive, and then suddenly she came to, only she said, "Hey, where am I? I'm not, I don't belong here," and came to remembering the life of a woman who had been who had recently been killed, as it turned out. So that was weird. I mean, so it's very hard to make any generalizations about the specific details of these cases because they're really all over the map, which I took as being fitting of a natural phenomenon, because when you look at nature, there's always a lot of variety in any given phenomenon, and there's a whole range of possibilities, and that's and that was what this reminded me of.
And again, like I said earlier, I love the fact that you guys looked at it from a scientific point of view, because it really does need, a lot of this stuff needs to be looked at from a scientific point of view, because a lot of scientists won't look at this stuff, and it's good to have that.
Right, but there's also problems in science, which is that you can't design an experiment very easily to test this. You have to just encounter these things, by hearing about them. You can't. It's very hard to sort of put this. You can't put this in a test tube.
No.
Or so it's more like social science. It's more like epidemiology or something like that.
Yeah, but if you talk to enough people and you take your notes, and you get enough notes put together, you begin to see those comparisons, with the cases.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what he did. He had thousands of cases in his files that he had documented, and he did statistical analysis on them and tried to find regularities and things. And mostly, what he found was that there was a whole range of possibilities. Like I said, I mean, they weren't all the result of violent deaths. Not everybody even remembered their deaths, and some did and some didn't. So, yeah, but there are always people who are saying, well, okay, so the big hole in this scientifically is, what's the mechanism? How does this happen? And nobody could even come up with a reasonable theory that you could test for, how does somebody's personality actually exist after the destruction of the body and brain, and how does that personality transfer to another body and brain? And people said stuff like, well, there's an astral body. Well, what's the evidence for astral bodies? There is none. There is no physical evidence for astral bodies. So that makes it difficult to say, okay, this is fascinating, this research, and these are really evocative collection of data here. But then where do you go from there? What's the next step in the scientific investigation? The next step would be to find some theoretical possibility for how this could happen. And, I just haven't seen any evidence that that's happening. Some people say, well, this whole weird sort of quantum physics thing could explain it somehow. But there's no connection between, I've looked into that, and there really is no connection between what they know about quantum physics and how some personality could transfer from one body to the next. So that's the big mystery, and like I said, it's that's what I try to explore in the afterward to the 25th edition that will be coming out next year.
As a journalist, what surprised you the most?
Well, when I remember, I had a book contract based on a proposal. And when I met Stevenson at the airport in Paris, getting ready to go for our first trip together, fly to Beirut, Lebanon, I was thinking, what happens if I'm with this guy for like one day and I realize he's a fraud or a loony? Then then I don't have a book. But I thought that was quite possible. I didn't know. But then, I had talked to him enough before so that what I suspected was true was that he was a very serious, honest, dignified guy who, who just was very careful and hardworking in his research, and who walked me. I at the time I was in my 30s, and and he was 80, and he could walk me, until I was exhausted. He'd get up early, he'd skip lunch, walk for miles and miles in uncomfortable situations, and he's like wearing his tie and jacket, in this heat, and he was really an amazing guy.
When you would ask questions, or when he would ask questions of these families, did he ask them individually, or did he ask them as a group? Because I know
he asked sometimes he threw a question out to the group, and sometimes he'd ask them individually, and sometimes it was through interpreter, and sometimes they spoke English. It was a whole variety of things.
Yeah, because the reason why I asked that is doing ghost hunting like I do on the side, and having come from a journalism background like yours, that's one thing I do is if I have a family that's having issues in their home, I will take them each separately to talk with them so that they don't sit in front of you. Because if people sit in front of you, right, I mean, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that, blah blah blah, and then they'll start building up on it.
He was very careful to isolate testimony, and to make sure that it wasn't polluted by, and if there was a source of contamination in the testimony, he would disregard it. He only was interested in finding uncontaminated testimony. So, like, for instance, he said to me, once these kids meet their previous life family, then anything they say from then on is suspect, because they could have, the family could have told them stuff.
Right.
So he was really only interested in the claims the child made when, that they were documented by various people in a believable way. Sometimes they were written down even, and claims that, that appeared to have no normal way of knowing about.
Now, all kids have imaginary friends. So what advice do you have after doing this research for people to look out for this sort of thing happening?
Well, I think in general, it's always good to take your kids seriously, to draw them out. Don't instantly shut them down or express your opinion about their beliefs. If they start saying, "Oh, this little sprite was talking to me over there," don't say, "Oh, you're imagining things." Just say, "Oh, really? What did they say? What were they like? How when do you see them?" Just be curious about it, curious and accepting, and listen to them. I mean, kids are fascinating, and the more you draw them out, and the more you're willing to sort of hear what they have to say, the more interesting it gets.
Tom, I want to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Well, and I can't wait for the next book. Oh my gosh. Okay. I love this stuff.
All right. Well,
I would love to have you. Yeah, I'd love to have you on when the next book comes out.
Yeah, well, when the 25th anniversary comes out in June, call me back up.
Sounds good. How can people find you, sir?
Oh, I have a website, tomshroder.com, which has all about me and my books. It's TOMSHRODER.com. There's no extra letters in Shroder, no C and no extra E.
So okay.
Just
all right.
SHRODER. All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great one. All right. Bye. All right, that was really cool. I mean, I'm really into that stuff, and I'm so glad he came on. Tomorrow, we're back at our usual time, and we're going to be talking about Sedona and the energy vortexes that are there with Benjamin Lone Tree. He's going to be with us tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. He's done a lot of research on Sedona. He comes from a background where he understands all about those energy vortexes and everything. So he'll be here tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. So we're on our usual time. I want to thank everybody for coming today. And again, if you like what you saw and heard, please be sure to follow on Facebook if you haven't done so already, and please be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you haven't done so already. And leave me a thumbs up, happy face, all that good stuff. Anyway, I appreciate you all coming today, and I'm going to let you go, and I'll give you his contact information and all that stuff on his books, and we're going to call it a day. So here we go. Website, tomschroder.com, SHRODER.com. And the book is Old Souls. It's a great book. I've read half of it. I haven't got through the whole thing, but it's a great, great book. And his other book is Fire on the Horizon, Seeing the Light, Acid Test, and The Most Famous Writer Who Ever Lived. And, of course, those can be purchased at Amazon and his website. So I'll see you guys tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.